And Andrew, we can, yep, kick off the recording. Perfect. And what time is it? We'll give just another 30 seconds. Let the stragglers come in. While we're settling, I just want to say thank you all for coming to OMOP Vocabulary 201. I'm Kristen Koska, and I'm really excited to be able to continue the discussion with you. For those of you who have participated in the last session, you'll know it's a lot of content. And so the idea really with this training series is to provide dedicated kind of brief sessions around certain concepts that are coming up. And we'll talk through some examples today of ways to really go through and optimize your understanding and be able to be more effective in the enclave and in your research. So for those of you who don't know me, I am a collaborator in the Odyssey community. I've been doing this OMOP thing for going on almost 6 years now. And my background is epidemiology and biostatistics. And I work a lot with folks as they do network research, as they become familiar with these funny things, Odyssey, OMOP, the terminologies. And hopefully, as you guys go through this, you'll be able to feel more comfortable as well. In N3C, I am actually on the phenotype work group, doing a lot of work with sites, getting their data in, and I'm also helping the DI&H team and even the collaborative analytics as needed. So feel free to ask questions as we go. Today's session is going to be really focusing on this idea of hierarchies and concept sets. And in just a moment, I'm going to give you a refresher. But what I'm hoping today is that you're going to walk away with a little better understanding of how to navigate these concept hierarchies, how to optimize concept sets. And we have a pretty good amount of time today, so I am planning to have this be fairly interactive in that we will have time for dedicated Q&A as we go. So please feel free to use the chat functionality. Andrew's going to help me as we go through to monitor to make sure that I'm answering questions as they come up. And I can see it blinking. Is there anything I should stop for right now, Andrew, that's in the chat that people are asking before we?
No, it's just me spamming, sorry.
Okay, no, that's perfect. So previously on OMOP 101, for those of you who may not have, remember what we talked about a few weeks ago, we talked a lot about the common data model, and we spent a lot of time in this right area where I have a red box. The standardized vocabularies are these tables that are actually part of the spine of the common data model, and they are maintained by the Odyssey community. You can download them and build them yourself. And we spent quite a bit of time kind of orienting to this idea of the concept as a thing. What are different ways that people interact with concepts across domains? And really, you can think of the vocabulary as a way to organize clinical information, and you have everything has an existence in that concept table, and then things have relationships between each other. So your organ systems are related, they're a higher level of describing what systemic impact a condition has. And so there are direct relationships and concepts. That's what we call our concept relationship. And then there's these multi-step hierarchical relationships that are pre-processed into what we call our concept ancestor table. And I'm not expecting you to remember all of this off the top of your head. We're going to really go through this in detail today. But just so you have some foundation, and if you recall, really the principles of the OMOP standard vocabulary are standardization. So we have all sorts of observational data coming in. And one of the reasons we created this is so that we could have this synthesis and consolidation of information, and we could handle different formats and life cycle conventions of different terms that are used in different systems and have a standard way to do that. There are these unique standard concepts, which are ways to for clinical entities to exist in this concept table. And you'll hear some language around non-standard and standard. We'll get into that again in just a moment. We have domains, which is where concepts are assigned. Those are the tables. Those are things like condition occurrence, drug exposure. And there's a lot of different ways, of course, that OMOP, in our conventions, we define how entities should place, but you can just kind of think of it as domains help anchor a lot of our organization in this model. And that's why it's one of the principles. Of course, we are aiming to have comprehensive coverage and that every event that is relative to the patient's experience are covered in the concepts of a domain. And we have these hierarchies, which is a way of organizing. And this really allows for us to query for all concepts and then take advantage of these things like the subsuming of by a higher order of organization. And so this addresses a bunch of different problems. We have the ability to then go up and down hierarchies, which is what we're going to do today. And you're going to have these relationships between concepts where and these mappings from these terms that are in local vocabularies to the standard. And of course, one of the principles of the vocabularies is this life cycle, keeping the representation up to date. So these are not static, they are changing over time. And you may see different variations depending on where people are in their maturity of implementing their ETL. And just to jog your memory again, the concepts as we define them, there's three categories of OMOP concepts. We have non-standard. In our tools, you'll often see this in like a maroon color. This is the unique representation of a source code. This is how it exists and how Epic captured it or how Cerner captured it or how it's coded in a registry. That is the unique way that it came into existence. In the middle, we have standard concepts, which are really used for standardized analytics and how we create these portable packages. This is a way to unify this information so that it is an apples to apples comparison. So we'll come to this in just a moment, but think of it as really the Rosetta Stone piece of it. And then above standards, you have these things we call classifications. These are really used to perform hierarchical queries. In the tooling, you might see them in like a purplish color, and these are your favorite things like ATCs or CVX and drugs. And they have a lot of utility because they can actually help us organize information and consolidate it in ways that are much faster than enumerating all the individual standards. And so last time we kind of talked a lot about the idea of non-standard, standard. We very briefly touched on this idea of classifications, but I'm not going to labor on that too much because that's what today is going to be. We're going to really focus on the right part of this. How do we use these hierarchies and how do we go through it? But before we get rolling, now that you've had a little bit of a refresher, I want to know how you're feeling about all of this. So this is what I like to call the Fauci scale. And how do you feel about OMOP vocabularies going into the session? So 1 is the most positive, 5 is you're feeling a little negative. For those of you who feel like sharing in the chat box, if you want to identify your current feelings on this, you can put a number in there. I'm gonna actually pull up the chat box to see it. 1. Oh, we have lots of positive. 11, I love it. Okay. So we have some positivity. So we're skewing somewhere in the middle, I think. And I do want folks to feel like it's okay to walk away from your first OMOP 101 and feel like, oh my gosh, I have no idea. I feel a little bit like Fauci at number 5 here. I'm just a little confused. I'm going to check in with you as we go through this, but it's okay to feel a range of emotions about absorbing this. It's a lot of content, and you will find yourself, sometimes it makes complete sense, and sometimes it's total mystery. And so I often find myself somewhere at 3, where even when I use it all the time, the vocabs can trick me, and it can be tough as I'm doing my research. So thank you all for sharing. We will come into some of these questions as we go. I want to be mindful that there are so many questions I've heard in the last few weeks about how do we use these. And so that's what today is really going to be about. Today's episode of this series that we're curating is really the idea of focusing on these standards and classifications. How do you use them? How do they interact with each other? And really, how do you traverse that hierarchy? It can be a little bit meandering at times. That's half the fun of the journey. But what we're going to do today is really talk through this with some concrete examples, especially as it relates to some domains that I think really you spend more time in than others in this thought. So as we move forward, just think about it first at this level. How do concepts relate to each other? So in principle, you have these source concepts, which are really how it is recognized in that unique representation in a system, that gets translated to some standard vocabulary. That won't be the same vocabulary in every domain. That's because, different domains have different coding systems. And then above it, we have these classification ontologies, which can further organize this. And there are relationships between concepts. There are also mapping relationships to how you get from a unique representation to a standard. All of that's part of the journey here. And if you're feeling a little overwhelmed with the terminology, I want to pause for just a moment and kind of orient you to some terms. So we talk about these standardized vocabularies. That's our system that those tables that we've built inside the CDM. And that's the vocabs, the classifications, the domains, and the concepts all in that common format in a way that it exists with your common data model. The vocabularies are the sets of codes or concepts. Really, these are things you already know quite well. I'm sure lots of you use IC9, ICD-10, or RxNorm, or CPT4, or HCPCS. These are really those, we're taking from those systems and we're organizing this content. And of course, the classification then is really that hierarchical system that defines the semantically useful classes. So this could be things like chemical structures for drugs. Domains are just this clinical semantic category where they exist in that data model. And then you have the concept and the concept class. And these are really the basic unit of information as it's defined in each vocabulary, as well as the attributes that are in these vocabularies. So this seems very abstract, and I know it is, but I just want to orient you to kind of some of the ways these things relate. The picture on the left kind of shows schematically how they come together. And it really starts to take weight and make sense as we go into Hierarchy 101.
Hey, Kristen?
Yep, go ahead.
We had a couple classification questions in the chat here. And
we'll come to that. We will come to that.
Okay, perfect.
Are they high level, or are they like specific, like how do I do X?
They're kind of high level, I think. We can come back to them in that section too.
You can shoot a couple right now, but this is exactly what today's lesson is about, is kind of distinguishing between the two. But if there's anything that seems like higher order, because this next section, we're actually going to go through some pretty worked examples. I'm hoping they'll get clearer. But yeah, is there anything higher order that before we get into kind of Hierarchy 101?
I think we can continue, and I'll clarify in the chat.
Sounds good. Not to say we don't want to take questions, but I promise this is actually like the topic of the hour. So I want to make sure that you guys get kind of the full story, and we can go through. If it's not clear, we can come back to those questions. So Hierarchy 101, really think about ancestry relationships. So this idea of how information can have higher level coordination. So in the conditions, we could have atrial fibrillation. It can be more detailed. It could have rapid AFib or permanent AFib, but could also be less detailed. We could have atrial arrhythmia. We could have fibrillation, supraventricular arrhythmia, cardiac arrhythmia, heart disease, and even just disease of the cardiovascular system. So we go from kind of less detailed to more detailed. That's sort of the nature of these relationships. And these concepts exist at each level. And the concept relationships are how these things connect to each other. So there's information in our tables that tell us that this is 1 degree from this term, or it's 2 degrees from that term. And these ancestry relationships really talk about this idea of how a whole class of things gets organized. And ancestors are things that are usually fairly kind of higher level of detail. So cardiac arrhythmia is an ancestor to AFib. And there are, from diseases of the cardiovascular system to AFib, 5 levels of separation. You'll see this a bit if you actually query the tables, and it's just telling you at what point you are in the hierarchy. It's just a numeric value to what level you started in and what level you're going to. So they can be positive, they could be negative. If you start in the middle, you could be 1 up and 1 -1 from something else. And of course, depending on where you are, you'll have different levels of separation. And really, just very simply, if you think about those tables, if you think about concept ancestor, it really is just creating the levels of separation between one unique concept and another. So if there's no separation, it's the same thing. But obviously there are lots of things that are at different levels. And we're not going to labor on this too much other than to say when you think about concept ancestors, they're really powerful because they have a lot of efficiency that you can use when you're defining, let's say, a list of terms you want to include in your concept set. And in the condition domain, it looks like this. We have SNOMED, we have different levels of SNOMED. We also, if you have this loaded in your vocab tables, you could use MEDRA as a classification. MEDRA in itself has different levels. And then of course, where it came from in your source system will have its own source vocabulary. I've been getting a lot of questions about the drug hierarchy. There are a lot of activities going on right now about how to build concept sets around drugs. So today we're really going to double down on this and talk through this in detail. High level, we can think about the drug hierarchy and the drug exposure domain. There's these standard concepts in the middle, which are your RX norm codes. Those will be ingredients, drug forms and components, drug products. We also have the ability to use drug classes like ATC or CVX. We have the source codes. There are quite a few source codes in here. We could even pull in procedure drugs. And drug may be one of the hardest hierarchies to traverse because there are so many entry points for this particular hierarchy. And it can be really, really confusing. Some of you may know RX norm really, really well. And I think very soon you're going to be able to create a mental map and realize there are lots of easy ways to navigate inside the concept table using your knowledge of RX norm. So I want to orient you to this idea of the concept class. Concept classes for the drug concepts are actually based on a subset of RX norm term types. So this table here is essentially on the left, it's the term types, the subset of term types that we've pulled in. Then we have the name and the concept class as it exists in OMOP. So concept class is a table, it's a reference table that has all this information about these different terms in it. And so if you know term types, if you've been using RxNav and that's how you interact with information, that is a wonderful foundation for interacting with this drug hierarchy because you have concept classes at your disposal. I'm going to pause for just a moment because I've heard this question asked a few times and I want to make sure this gets answered. I think Devira, you've asked me this question a few times. Are there any questions folks have just kind of absorbing this as a reference? We're going to go through some examples in just a moment.
We have a couple of questions in chat too, so it's a good time. So the kind of high level classification concept questions, kind of back to where we were a few minutes ago. So are classification concepts and standard concepts disjointed classes, or some standard concepts also classified concepts?
The way they exist in the data model, you'll have a column that will be, is it standard concept ID? I can actually show you the table. You'll only ever see S or C, or it'll be blank in that column. And you will not have it will never say S comma C. You'll only ever have a thing as a standard or a classification, but there are ways to relate them, right? So as we go through this, what you can think about is classifications are very much relatives of the standard, but they are not intended to do the same thing as the standard. Does that make sense? Like we're kind of stitching together the RX norm, the beauty of RX norm and how it organizes information. And then classifications could be ways like how we use ATC to find members of a drug class, or we find ingredients of a drug. That's kind of the idea of why concept class becomes important, because it's how you can begin to relate these things together.
Perfect. And then I'm going to paraphrase this one, and we have looks like two more after this. What's up with ancestor links? That's me paraphrasing. Are they needed beyond the direct child parent link? Or are they just there for convenience?
It depends. So when we go through I have a few examples. It may be useful to know things in the ancestry because depending on where you start in the hierarchy, if you start really, really detailed, at the one of the finest grains, you then get the luxury of rolling up and having kind of buckets to be able to report on. So I find, especially in drugs, when I'm doing visualizations, having different ancestors that I can report on is actually really helpful because if I have too much enumerated information, let's say at the ingredient level, maybe I want to go up a level with that classification. So it a little bit depends on your use case. It may just be something that's kind of helpful information if you're not, trying to visualize the content or you're not creating some report out of it, but it's there for your benefit more than anything.
So follow-up question on that then. So I guess why is the relationships needed if ancestry exists? And we do have two other questions.
Relationships are more than just one level, right? So imagine in your family, right? You have a relationship with your mom or dad. You have a relationship with your grandparents, with your siblings. They're not the same kind of relationship, right? And that's kind of the idea of these terms, that in clinical information, we have different ways that information comes together. And we're not going to spend too much time on it today, but especially as you're doing maps too and figuring out kind of how, let's say, the components of something roll into a bigger way of delivery. So like in vaccines, the CVX to RX norm, how do those come together? That's where relationships can be quite useful. It kind of stitches together the pieces. And so they're not all the same types of things versus ancestry, descendant. It is kind of like different degrees of moving from, your family tree. But you may want to know things besides just going down and up the tree. You might want to know how they traverse together or how they relate at different levels. So a little confusing maybe, but it'll make more sense as we go through it. But it is a good question, and I think it really depends on what you're looking for, that these tables may provide you more benefit than others.
All right, and then so in many ontologies, the distance in the links does not mean much. Does OMOP always consider that terms separated by 3 links are less similar than terms separated by 2 links?
Truthfully, I don't think that in my research, I ever kind of use just that, degrees of separation as the only way that I relate the content. I know Karthik's on the phone too. Maybe he can add, but I'm not sure if that it's there. It's an artifact. It's one of many data points that you can use from these concept tables to kind of build your understanding of how well a job you've done at finding the clinical thing you're looking for. But we can definitely come back to that as we go through. I think it depends on your persona and how you're interacting with the information.
Okay, and then I think this is the last one. If I apologize if I missed you, just please direct me, and we'll make sure we get to you. So from Devira, kind of I think follow-ups to the drug thing. After filtering to standard only codes in my set, I would find a straggler topical dose forms when I started with an ATC dose specifically for synthesis meds. Oh, I think she might have figured it out. Is that correct, Devira? You can also unmute if you need to.
Well, that was my question, and we talked about that before, Kristen. So you prompted me that Devira had questions about this. I would start with an ATC code classification to drive to the standard, and then use the filtering to get to the standard codes in OMOP. But what I would find is that there were straggler topic. I could search on topical and find a few stragglers. Not a big deal, but in the interactions you and I had, not looking at examples, you kept telling me, well, it should, that's the way it works, or it's supposed to work. And I just kind of felt like if you started with an ATC code specifically for that particular dose form, that in my mind would be a way to just limit your set to that. So it's not a big deal to filter on those, to find them. But that was the outstanding issue that I had when you prompted before.
I would say when it comes to ATC, we are stealing, not writing, right? So we are actually leveraging a publicly available resource. There is an ATC work group led by Hamed Abatash out of he's at Eli Lilly. He does a lot of work kind of looking at the appropriateness of the mappings and improving that. So I do think that if people find things that look suspicious as they go through, it's perfectly reasonable to file a bug or, you know, a ticket in the vocab GitHub and say, can this get investigated? This looks weird. Sometimes it happens that there are very strange things in the vocabularies that we take from. Sometimes it has to do with over time. Sometimes there can just be, you know, defects in how things are being synthesized, and maybe a concept code has been depreciated or changed over time, and that can cause issue. Reuse of codes is a real pain, right? So we can come back to this. I would say, you know, ATC is not perfect, and it's really helpful, and I'm going to use it today for some examples. But if you know from your own clinical experience that something doesn't look right, by all means, trust your clinical experience and communicate with our vocab folks, both in the enclave and in the community, because, you know, these are humans curating huge sets of terminologies, and there's always potential for things that are missed or places for optimization or improvement.
No, that's really great feedback. Thanks. It meant, and that it's completely reasonable, you know, that there might be some things in the content that aren't quite right, which doesn't mean that, you know, we're not doing our search or build right, and the fundamentals are good. So it's good. It's good to have that feedback. Thanks.
Yeah, and keep the questions coming, guys. So I wanted to kind of get into the live action part of the film here so that you guys can kind of feel like we're cruising through and not just looking at slides. So I want to orient you to your toolkit. There's actually 3 pieces in this toolkit. The first being Athena, which is athena.odyssey.org. That's the public vocab browser. It's really just a visual way of looking at the vocab tables. And there are some limitations both in Athena and in Atlas around some vocabularies, as you might know, require licenses. And Athena, in the download tab, you'll be able to see all the vocabularies that are supported, but you may not see all of the licensed vocabularies as searchable. And that's simply a part of the agreement with the vocabulary license entities, that they don't want it publicly displayed on a website. You could download it. If you have your own license, you could see it. But a great example would be like if you're looking for convalescent plasma, and that's often coded in ISBT vocabulary, ISBT 128, right? You won't see that in Athena, but it is actually in the tables, and you can download it and use it if you have a license. So just a little bit of a caveat that it's a great resource. We're going to use it today, but there are occasionally things that you can't see, and that's just the nature of it being on a public server. Its companion here is one of our public Atlas instances. This is, again, a public site. Anyone can use it. You can build concept sets here, and lots of you have been playing with this. The caveat here is the vocabulary tables will be specific to whatever tables they downloaded and instantiated in that Atlas. As some of you have found, sometimes there are different tables, like different versions of vocabularies used at different sites. The vocabularies are, part of our lifecycle updates. They get updated a lot. And so your view of the vocabs will be relative to when did you download and what version are you using. It shouldn't be a huge issue, but the real place where you would see it around COVID would be for link codes, making sure you have, the freshest vocabulary tables. So our friends in the Enclave, I know the Palantir team has worked hard with the Hopkins team. Stephanie, Ben, and Richard and Tanner, they're all doing a really great job of curating resources inside the Enclave. That's your 3rd resource in your toolkit. I'm not going to show that today. However, if you want to learn how to start to query those tables, they are in the data catalog. They're available there. I know we're going to be getting more proficiency there, but in the slides you'll get back from me, you'll also see, for the SQL lovers in the room, all the exercises we're going to go through today, you'll have them in SQL, so you can actually query them against that spot of the Enclave if you have permission to see it. So I know that's a lot of orientation to just kind of what you have, where you're going. And so I want to get into some exercises because I think that seeing and doing make this a lot easier. This stuff can be quite confusing until you're kind of living it. So we're going to start with this idea of, if you're in the drug hierarchy, how do I find ingredients of a drug? That happens all the time, right? So we're going to open up our friend Athena, and we could start here. So maybe I know that I have a drug like Plavix. Plavix comes in many forms. It's a brand name. I could have information just on the brand. I could search that string. I could search a very specific formulation of it. So maybe I know I have Plavix 75 milligrams and it's oral. You could search with whatever information you have available to you. And so what Athena's going to do when you search for that is give you back a bunch of things that are related to that string that you've searched for. And you see here that we're immediately seeing a bunch of content from this DMD vocabulary. There's some SNOMED terms here. And so what you may want to do just to start would be to pick which vocabularies you're looking at. So we're not working outside the US, so we might want to go more so for something more US centric like NDC. You'll see Mark's norm is in here too. You'll have to scroll. You can type it too, but so immediately you might find, filtering down on vocab would be helpful. So you can see, you can also search by the ATC levels. So in this view, you immediately can take advantage of both standard, non-standard, and classifications all in one simple thing. That's what's kind of neat about Athena. It doesn't make you have to know exactly what part of the vocab you're in. It just lets you kind of play with it. And so when I'm looking at this term, I see that there are lots of different things I could do here to further refine my query. So I could use concept to filter if I wanted to just find the standards or the classifications related to Plavix. The domain here is going to relate to where in the OMOP common data model it would live. The majority of this is going to be in the drug domain. There may be some devices that this is associated to. You'll see other things are grayed out because those are it's not going to show up in those domains. So it's kind of self-limiting for you. And then the class, and this is why I stopped for a moment to orient you. For those of you who know these term types, these concept classes, you will have the ability then to start to filter using that. So if you know, this is a brand name. It's also could be a branded dose group. You could have the clinical drug form, even the clinical pack, dose form group. All of this is available to you. I may say, you know what, I'm actually looking for ingredients. And you know what, wow, I got back junk. And that's because what happened is I actually haven't traversed to the right place. So sometimes I'll filter down, but I need to do one more thing so that it really knows what I'm asking for. So I'm not going to jump directly to there, but I might decide to look for, I see this is Plavix. It's a non-standard, but it's the brand name. Well, I know this drug, and I want to look inside its kind of record, if you will. This term then gives me more information. So I see that this is non-standard, which means this is how it's uniquely represented in a source system, but this is not necessarily the way I would build a query with a code so that I can get the same thing across many, many databases. I have to find its standard. And that's where this relationship column comes in. I can now see that this is a part of, there's the Plavix oral product. There's a bunch of different parts of RxNorm I could use. I have some RxNorm extensions. Those are really more for ex-US. And you'll see there's different, really, these are usually related to packaging formulations. And there's a ton of information here because when you start with brand, you are actually kind of starting quite higher order. And so I'm looking for the ingredients of the drug, and I have the ability here, has precise ingredient. So this, if I think about my question as I started, I knew what drug I was looking for. I found a record of it that looked familiar to me. It's a brand name that I know. And now I know from relationships that this is the precise ingredient. And if I click on this, this is going to be its maps to. It's going to be the thing that is the standard. This is a precise ingredient class ID for this. Actually, this is a non-standard. So I have to go up one more level to the political, which is a form of in the relationship. So I'll pause for just a second. It in drugs can be quite cumbersome to do this from a web UI-based way of doing it, because you're traversing from a place in the hierarchy, such as brand. Maybe you're looking then for precise ingredient. Then you're looking for the standard term. That can be a couple of hops, and that means a couple of screens and a couple of clicks. So this method may not be the fastest for you. It may not even be anywhere close to fast. But if you're really curious about kind of getting into all of the attributes about that term, that's what Athena is good for. So I'll pause for just a moment. Andrew, I can't see if the chat is blinking.
We have one question from kind of last section, and then if anybody has any drug questions, please put them in chat. The question was, can the ancestry table be derived from the relationship table? There's some more context to that too. If I didn't get that, well, just let me know.
So in terms of using the ancestry table, I'm actually going to pull up some of the SQL. A huge piece of when you are playing around with looking at kind of the attributes of your the term you're starting and the term you're going is by using the ancestor concept IDs and descendant concept IDs. The relationships become useful if you are trying to move between, I don't have an example of this here. It kind of has to do with if you're trying to find things that are part of something bigger. Generally, the ancestry is really, I'll just show you. So if you were to query it, let's say we're going to do, I'm looking for this Plavix drug at the data layer level, right? And I know that its concept ID is, I know this concept ID because I looked it up and I found this is what its concept ID is, but I don't really know its relatives. Ancestry table then allows me the ability actually to very quickly take this descendant and find all of its relatives. And that's where these levels of separation come in. So I'm not sure for the question asker if that helps.
I guess the question, and I think I am drawing this from the other questions earlier, was that, does the ancestry table provide any unique information that couldn't be grabbed if you were really into recursively searching the relationship table?
The levels of separation, I'm trying to think. It's much more efficient to use the concept ancestor table to traverse how something is related to its parts, if that makes sense. So you can use the concept relationship, but this is kind of like a faster, cleaner, more comprehensive way to do that.
Yeah, that clarifies. Thank you.
And it's kind of worth saying, I find sometimes actually at the data layer, sometimes it's easier to see some of this stuff than in the web-based browsers, just because as soon as you can kind of see all the joins that you would have to do for some of the other views, then it becomes very straightforward. Oh, this is how I do this. So somebody was asking about how standards or concepts come into existence. Yep, go ahead.
I was unmuted. I hope it's okay to interrupt. I was just wondering, why are maximum levels of separation important for you? Because the semantic difference, it will, according to the number of links, will just completely differ according to where you are and what what you're doing.
Right. So that's why it's important to think about your use case. If you're looking to find ingredients of a drug, the max level of separation may help you understand at what point in the hierarchy you are in that and looking for ingredients of that drug, which is to say, things in this query are very specific, right? They're actually down to a dose and it shows the product is oral, right? Versus higher up in the levels of separation, they're less detailed. Some of them are different vocabularies. It's really just to kind of give you a sense of things that are at the same part of the hierarchy. How you use it depends on what you're doing with the concept set, but you can traverse up and down to your heart's content using these relationships between descendant concept IDs and ancestor concept IDs. And then kind of the utility of knowing the standard versus classification would be classifications can have descendants that roll up into a whole list of things. And I'll show you that becomes easier to see in Atlas. But it just kind of shows you just different ways to get to different parts of it. So it may not mean anything to you, but it may help you know, are you too far down or do you need to go up, right?
We had a follow-up question too, I think here from Heidi. Is Athena linked to the enclave directly, or can I browse it like you're doing, Kristen, outside of Palantir, or maybe both?
Yeah, it's freestanding. So Athena is actually not maintained by the Enclave team. This is a public resource from the Odyssey community. The Odysseus data services team actually maintains it. So this will be just the tables as they are. Anyone can use it. You just have to, basically, I think it has a Google authentication. So you can link your Google account to it and it lets you log in. Once you're able to log in, anyone can search, but the login functionality allows you, if you wanted to, download vocabularies and use them yourself for your own efforts, not necessarily inside the Enclave, just in general, you're learning vocabs, you want to play with them. You can do that when you download, but if you don't have a license to some of the ones that require licenses, you will have kind of a traffic cop in the in-between. Someone does kind of broker to make sure that those are in compliance. So there are lots of tables one can download. You might say, I don't understand, like, how does this relate to what's in the Enclave? The Enclave team has done the hard part for you. They have downloaded the ones that are relevant to the data that's coming in through the DINH pipes and the phenotype script, and they've created a vocab instance that has all the vocabs that you need to do research in that data, and all the and they've kind of put it there, and then it exists in a way that you can then query it with the data that exists. So Athena is just an online browser. Anyone could hang out here. It's free. You could go right now. We're not going to bump into each other. Free tool. And then in the Enclave, I don't know. I think a lot of people, if you have the right agreements in place, like your DUAs, DURs, the data catalog has those available, but I would defer to Andrew and folks on exactly who can see that, but it is part of the data catalog as well.
We have a follow-up question from Peter, and Peter, I'll unmute you too if that'll help. But the previous question prior to the Athena question, in terms of reproducibility, does that worsen the, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, in just depending on how things are set up in sort of at least most of the open source ontologies in the bioinformatics field, every descendant term of a given term should be included. And so if you allow users to include only 1 level, 2 levels, or 3 levels, this is just going to sort of add noise to the. I mean, it doesn't make sense to limit the number of descendants. And I'm wondering, I'm guessing I'm just not as understanding something. I'm wondering if you could give us an example of where limiting the level of descendants will improve results by reducing noise in some way.
Yeah, so let's go through this through Atlas because it becomes a little easier. Athena just sees things as in the table, but Atlas can actually show you how these things come together with record counts behind it. So how information is actually existing in a CDM. But there's a lot of user decision rights in how you deploy these. So let's say I'm in an Atlas instance. So Atlas is, more than just a vocab table. It's actually got a lot of functionality to it. But the search functionality is basically the same as Athena. I can search a term like Plavix, and immediately I return results. And if you orient back to our colors we were talking about before, I see a lot of purple. Purple is a classification. So that is, by definition, not the standard. It's a way to organize information, but it's not deemed kind of that interoperable level that we're at. You'll see down here, purple, maroon, and blue, just to remind you. So if I'm looking for Plavix and I want to limit to, let's say I'm actually looking for the RX norm terms that relate to Plavix. So by having a tool like Atlas to start, you actually have the ability, you have these two columns which are unique to how these vocab tables exist. They actually have a vocab schema that has been run on the CDM, and it knows just how many times that concept exists, and then its descendants exist. And so what we find as you're building concepts, having this is really helpful because you can also see, if you're missing anything, leaving anything on the table. But users have the right, when they build a concept set, you'll choose at the concepts you want to pull in. So building a concept set is the thing that's unique to Atlas from Athena. Athena is just simply browsing, seeing those relationships, having that view. Atlas is really where you can kind of pull these things together and say, I want to use them analytically. And if I'm searching for Plavix and I decide I want to look into maybe a specific term. So this is a branded drug comp that's its class ID from RxNorm. If I wanted to see how it relates in the hierarchy to other terms, I can see that here. Now, some of you have found that if you start in a classification, you can't see hierarchy, even though there is a hierarchy. And that's because this term is actually looking for standard concept is S, as you saw in that table. So it only populates with that. It'll say the same error message, non-standard, for both classification and non-standard. It's just a user design thing. So don't let it trip you up, but start with standards if you want to use this tab. So in this tab, I can see clopidogrel. I have one level above it. This is actually the ingredient code that's in RxNorm. I could see I'm at this branded drug comp level. I have these children. Now, how does your data reflect the term that you're on? It depends on what it was coded in the source system. So if your source system codes things very generically, let's say it only codes it in the ingredient level, it might be mapped to just this level. And that would be what RC means, record count at exactly that level in the hierarchy. DRC is the descendant records from that level or below, or from below that level. So this becomes part of your balance of what terms you want to include. And you can build concept sets using, so if I wanted to use this, let's say I wanted to go down this level, I want the 34 million at this level, I could select this concept. There's this little shopping cart thing that allows me to select it. And I'm beginning to pull it into a concept. Now,
Kristen?
Yes.
Andrew, sorry, you're doing such an awesome job as always. I wanted to see if I could give a really concise answer to Peter's question he followed up with in the chat about why not just have a concept, everything in the subdag. Why wouldn't you want that? Can I just give
Go
before
ahead.
you carry on sort of so imagine, Peter, that you want to develop a concept set for viral pneumonia. And some sites code that very exactly. Other sites or other people at the same site will just code it as pneumonia. So there's variation. It's not a standard way, the way data is collected. So in order to get the real viral pneumonias, you would have to go up the hierarchy to just get sort of a general pneumonia, and then go down the hierarchy and exclude things other than viral pneumonia from it. So you don't, the reason you want to not just get everything that's subsumed at the right point in the hierarchy is that data are collected in various ways, and you need to take that into account. And the process that Christian's illustrating shows you how you figure that out using the information about the descendant rows and so forth as to what it is you're getting and how to understand whether you've gotten it right. So it's not, so the proper choice isn't just the semantically correct one. It's the one that reflects how data are actually captured at various degrees of precision and what you might need to do to exclude some things, or include things higher or lower in the hierarchy. Does that,
That's
Peter,
helpful. Thank you.
does that make sense?
Why doesn't OMOP do this when data is being transformed from the electronic health record to the OMOP database?
Because we don't change it. So one of the biggest tenets of design is we want the source code or the source concept, we want it to reflect as it was uniquely represented in the system. It's not supposed to be changed at that point in time. It's supposed to be kind of for data provenance. That's your source of truth of however it was coded in that EHR. And then the standard is obviously how we can traverse between these different levels of detail, but they're relatives. But in the purest camps of OMOP, we don't encourage changing the source concepts, because that is a form of provenance of kind of going back. And for ETL, it can help you debug as well, right?
Okay, well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And it's important to know it's totally your preference what level you choose. And so the longer kind of way through these things is you may only want certain formulations, you may not want certain descendants. I know some folks don't feel as comfortable because certain things roll up and they're like, I don't really trust that. But there are a couple ways you can address that. So if you're traversing from a concept, you're going through the different pieces, a single concept selected at that level with no descendants will pull whatever records are coded there. If I click the descendants, then it obviously pull all the children. And I can see pretty quickly too in the included concepts kind of, what are the things that I'm pulling in by clicking that box and using that hierarchy. And so I find the hierarchy is really helpful because I don't always know all the things that roll underneath, these terms. And it's helpful to have a view of the things and that things more detailed. But, there are lots of use cases where you look through this and you say, oh, I really didn't want some formulation. And you could, let's say, these probably aren't a good example, but as Andrew said, viral pneumonia, there are different things in the condition in the SNOMED hierarchy that may not be things you want. If you saw something in your list, you're like, I really don't like this included concept. You could take advantage of the hierarchy and then simply pick one that you don't like and say, I want to exclude that. And I don't just want to include that. I want to exclude the things that are more detailed than that. Looks like that maybe is the lowest level for that. So that's kind of a benefit of what's there. I know a lot of validation goes into concept set management. And so it's really your choice and preferences as an end user. And if you're not overly comfortable still with this idea of standards, which are, the codes we're using kind of across the databases, you can actually look and see all the included source codes inside that. So those are the source concept IDs that are uniquely represented, that are pulled into that hierarchy. This tab always takes forever to load. It's not the world's fastest. It's pulling a huge number of things. So the bigger your number is right here, the longer it'll take to load. Sometimes it just doesn't load at all. And that's just being honest that this is part of the fun. There are other ways to get to this information, but if this happens to you, you're not alone. This happens a lot. This is one of the more complicated joins, right? I'm actually saying, look at the things that are standards. Now pull all the source concept IDs that relate to that. So it'll come back, and maybe I'm lowering the bar too low, but sometimes if that number said 2000, it might spin for a bit. But now you can see all the NDCs that are in there. You could actually filter on different vocabs. It's going to show you all of them. If you would prefer to use like these term types that you're familiar with, you can actually use class. That's where those will show up. And so that's all at your disposal. And that's kind of one of the unique parts of Atlas as a tool. It's all kind of in a quick pane view, even though you could do the same thing with your with your tables. So the idea of searching for an ingredient, it's really this idea of you can start with things and move around, but maybe you don't want to start with an ingredient. Maybe you're actually looking for members of a drug class. So let's say you're looking for corticosteroids. We'll start with corticosteroids, but maybe you're thinking, I want to look for corticosteroids that are for local oral treatment. And we know that in ATC, we have lots of different ways we can describe corticosteroids. So I may look through the different terms. I can actually change how many terms are rendered to by the drop down. And I see lots of different terms that I could potentially pull in here. But you know what? I'm not seeing exactly what I'm looking for. I see for systemic use, that's not exactly what I'm looking for. So I might, optimize my my search. Maybe I'll try a different way. You know, different ways of querying get you different results because it's going on the strings. It's not as smart. Athena has a slightly smarter brain. So if you're in a spot here where you're like, oh, I'm just not getting anything from, I was really looking for that ATC that's for corticosteroids for local oral treatments. This is where you might find going back to Athena is really helpful. It's a lot faster to just quickly mine for the terms. My browser is frozen. We'll open up the other one. So if you're in Athena, you could do the same search and you might get to your answer just a little bit quicker because Athena is really meant to be to quickly expose the those vocab tables as fast as possible. And I see there's a blinking IM. Are there any questions, Andrew, that you want to interject here?
Yes. So I think we just addressed Sarah's question, but in case not, when would you click map? Andrew Williams, I think, hit it. I just want to make sure if there's anything we need to follow up on.
So
on
yeah,
that one.
mapped is actually it's an interesting column. And my browser is really unhappy about doing two things at once. Let me try flooding another window. So mapped actually is kind of like off-label OMOP column. It's there, but most people don't use it because the idea with mapped is that you're actually traversing and including non-standards in your concept set, which is kind of like, I wouldn't say not allowed, but it's highly discouraged because non-standards, as we said, are uniquely represented in a in that data. So we can't guarantee that every database is using the same non-standards, but we can guarantee that standards are available, right? I know it sounds kind of silly. So mapped would be actually clicking, if you picked a non-standard, you could click the button mapped and it would pull the things that maps to, use the mapped relationship. But use it. You're not, it's there. It's a feature. It's definitely lesser used in network research, but it's your preference if you are in a non-standard. That's technically how it functions. But don't say I told you it was the best way, but it's certainly available for you as an end user if that really is a way you want to traverse the table. Start with those non-standards.
So Kristen, what I said was it's reserved because it sort of defeats the point of doing the mapping from source concepts to standard concepts. It's discouraged, and it's there primarily if you know there's a problem in the particular areas that you have to work with. If there's a really clearly identified issue where the mapping from source to standard concept isn't going to get you what you want, then you have it as an option. But it's sort of a fallback, and it breaks a lot of the value and logic of the whole rest of the setup, where you're relying on this very extensive mapping of source concepts to standard concepts. So in general, it's discouraged and should be reserved for those cases where you know it's not getting you what you need.
Yep. And a good example of times I've used non-standards in concept sets, that Z11.59 code does not map into a standard that is as detailed as Z11.59. So we are in making the exception to use the observation source concept ID in the phenotype to look for that, because we know that that's a really specific code for a very specific use case. So sometimes you could. The other thing is it actually, programmatically, when you build concept sets, we are assuming you're going to put them into logic where you're querying the concept ID. So in the domain, it would be like the drug concept ID, or in the condition occurrence, the condition concept ID. Why is that important? Because actually the source concepts are in a different column. So you actually have to do something different programmatically to tell it to go to that source concept ID. So just a little design nuance in it. And so if we are looking, and I don't know why my browser, we'll take a break in just a second. Yep.
I have another question here too, and just a time check. We're about halfway through, so we have about an hour left, just for folks to be aware. So there's plenty more to come. And then Bruce had a question regarding querying. So the key clinical concepts here would be Cephridogel, I'm sorry if I got the drug name wrong, loading dose with a timestamp, typically 300 milligrams at 1, and a maintenance dose, typically 75 milligrams daily. So how would you query those concepts? And Bruce, I can unmute you. That would help.
So let me try to search for you. Sorry, my browser is being a little finicky. So the idea of your drug exposures would be if you would have a record in the drug exposure table for each of those drugs that are delivered. So there'd be a drug concept ID for the first formulation. I think you said it was like 300 milligrams or whatever the dosing was. You'd have one record for that and the date, stamp, and time associated to delivery. For your other dose, you'd actually have another record in the drug exposure table for that person receiving that formulation of the drug. And they would just be different concepts that you would be looking for. Now, drug era is another thing we haven't really talked that much about. Drug era is a way that we roll up drug exposures into continuous exposure. It's a computed kind of method to show time on therapy. There are scripts that I can send links to that may show kind of that cumulative time because of the ingredient. I think it's a shared ingredient if I'm following. So happy to direct to some materials about that specifically. There's some great examples in our materials around how drug eras and drug exposures exist together. But in general, when we're querying it, you get that choice where you can be in the drug exposure table and look at the enumerated dose each time the drug is delivered. And then you have the drug era is more like the cumulative time on therapy. There's also dose era, which is the ability to see cumulative time on dosing that can be derived from CDMs. Does that help?
Yes,
that's great, because there are a lot of sort of loading dose, maintenance dose things that are clinically relevant, and that covers what would be needed. Thanks.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to set up time. I know Ken and Gersing and Claire Blacketer have been talking about total daily dose and how the methodologies to do this. I think that is absolutely a great special topic that we could follow up with if folks have an interest, or if there are specific things you're trying to create for a study. Those domain teams, I know you guys are really busy doing a lot of great work. I'm happy to carve out time to go through your specific use case and orient you to kind of best practice and sometimes caveats. Sometimes our data, we wish we had more information, but we get stuck because what's coded in the source system is only so can only get us about 2/3 of the way, and then we have to kind of make design choices.
Yeah, so your example just was relevant to me as a cardiologist, so I just wanted to kind of understand that loading versus maintenance, and that was great. I think it's covered. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm biased. I started in a cath lab for my research days, so I regularly will give you guys cards, examples, but please feel free to ask about other domains or other therapeutic areas. And before we take a short break, I just want to kind of close the thought of what we were doing around this idea of looking for members of a drug class. So let's say you're thinking about corticosteroids for local oral treatment and you don't know the ATC off the top of your head, like the code of how you would look for it. You could just search corticosteroids for local oral treatment in Athena. And as you notice, it's a little bit easier here. It quickly comes back with what I was looking for. That's just like a little bit of an efficiency hack of, I tend to do a lot more just very quick term searching in this tool, and then I bring it over to Atlas to actually build the concept set. So this ATC 4th level actually allows me to see the terms that are in that drug class, so I can see it subsumes, or it has these pieces. Why is this helpful? Well, we were talking a bit, there were some questions on the outset about classifications, usage, and I think what's really quite nice is these classifications can help us quickly answer a question like, who are members of this drug class? And we can see these are the subsumes. And then I would, want to build a concept set with these terms. I can bring these over to the other screen in a second. But really, that's a benefit of having ATC as a classification. You can take advantage of the way it organizes information. And obviously you can even go up to the somatological preparations or go further down. So I'll pause for just a moment. I know this is a lot of information and there's a lot to digest on a Friday afternoon.
We have a couple other questions too. So I think Harold, your question might have gotten answered. If not, we can hit that next. Joanna has a question around concepts. Is there a way to build a concept that includes patients, join of two parent codes, or do we have to handle that separately within the code workbook? For example, we want to look at STEMI patients, but would also include patients that don't have a STEMI code, but who have both parent codes, ST segment evaluation, and acute mitochondrial infection. And I will unmute you as well if you need to follow up.
That's a great question. And so one of the things we haven't really explicitly covered, but it's definitely worth saying, they're concepts, concept sets, they're a list of codes, right? They are not intended to be a cohort definition. That's kind of like what they grow up to be. You take them, you put them in some logic. So you could do it two ways. If you wanted to build a concept set that pulls all the concepts that you are comfortable with for that clinical state, you could do that. You may not. You may say, I want to build one concept set for the really clean things I'm looking for, and I want a second concept set of these, it depends situation. I'm going to put some logic around this. That's kosher. You could do that. How would that play out in kind of your use of the code? So in my world, I would turn that into a cohort definition. I would actually take it in Atlas and actually take your concept set and say, the entry event to get into this cohort is this look in condition occurrence for this concept set. And then I might have a second piece of logic, or the people who have, this other set of codes that are a little bit like, I don't know. It depends on, I'm not sure if you have anything about frequency of use or anything like that, but the luxury or utility of having them separated would be, you can create individual pieces of logic for each of these that allow you to create so one concept set could be, your one set, and it's actually, this is not the right domain for this. One set for your STEMI things that you feel are very cleanly mapped, and this is for the other. But what's neat about it is you can actually add attributes around that, so you can be further kind of stringent. So you can kind of do that post coordination in a cohort definition. In terms of in the vocabs, you can always present a use case to the vocab team if there's some way you're suggesting for optimization in the pre-coordination. I know lots of people suggest ways to do it for certain things that are a clinical state that they want to standard way, but it depends. I don't know, Andrew Williams, if you have any experience with that. I feel like Christian has taught me just put it in a cohort definition, but I guess it depends, right?
Yes.
So maybe the answer there would be, as you're using it in the enclave, if you would, I'd be happy to work with you to show you. You in your code book, you can just explicitly kind of create lists of those terms. But you may want to have them separate so you can actually evaluate as you run and bring people in, different kind of the not quality of the thing you're looking for, but it gives you kind of a little bit of the ability to say, oh, you know what? Maybe I don't need this criteria because I'm getting 90% of my people from this criteria. So it all depends on your design. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm going to give you guys a 5-minute break because you've been very good sports, and I feel like you need time to digest. And I'm also going to check in on you guys and when we come back and see how you're doing on your Fauci scores. But want to take like a 5-minute breather? Back. I know you are a captive audience, so I want to check in and see how folks are feeling. How are you feeling on the Fauci scale as we navigate this very dense topic on a Friday afternoon? If you feel comfortable to put your answers in the chat, I'd say I'm at a 2. I don't know about you guys. I'm feeling okay.
Can one exceed a 1? So can I
You
be
could.
a
I
0
don't.
or like a
I have to.
-5? Just
I'll
be
have to
super
modify
happy.
the instrument. Yeah, isn't that what all gold standards are meant to be? Modified.
Ooh, Devira's the 0.5.
Nice. I'll have to update the scale to have more options. Well, hopefully this is starting to help. Now that I have restarted my browser, I can show you guys a little bit more, but it's okay also to feel like you're still a 4 or a 5. This stuff is hard. I've been doing OMOP studies for going on 5 years at this point, so I have a little bit of a running start. I do have some hacks I'm going to show you guys too, depending which tools you're in. And going forward, I definitely want to work to get more resources available to folks. So if there's things that come to mind as you're watching this, you're like, oh, it'd be so helpful if I could see how to insert whatever your use case is. We'd be happy to do more worked examples. And so as we dive back in, I think it's really important we orient to kind of what we have available to us. So if you're in the enclave and you have access to different things, your access to the vocab tables is actually in the project, in the data catalog. You can actually see them. So I'm not sure exactly how many users have this permission set yet, but we can certainly work in the data catalog. These things called OMOP concepts. This is actually the vocab tables as they exist in time and space as they've been loaded into the enclave. And you can see they get updated all the time. The team's working really hard on a very frequent refresh schedule. So why am I showing you this? Because as you're doing research with the N3C OMOP, it really helps to start with the tables that are actually in use, because there is some variability in the concepts you see. In one instance, like my local environment that I do most of my analytics on may have slightly different tables because we don't update our databases as frequently. So we're pulling we're a little bit behind. You might be ahead. So I don't have worked examples yet. I'm still kind of getting up to speed in the enclave, but in the future, we plan to have resources here to show you how to do some Spark SQL. But for those of you who are just curious, if you do, someone was asking about code workbooks and how you touch it, this is exactly where these tables are. And these will have very much the same attributes of what we're talking about, but just so you can see kind of how it exists. So that's one resource for you. And of course, in the tables, they'll look just like what they do in the public references. But I think a lot of you may find you're not going to be writing SQL queries against these unless that's really your jam. You pick as a user. You may find cruising through concept sets is kind of easier for you, and so there is obviously a whole world of tools available there. But one of the things I want to emphasize is that these are really just different ways to get to the same endpoint. So it's what you're comfortable with. And if you're trying to understand, like, how do I move between environments, I just want to show you really quickly this idea of you can build it. This is a public environment. So, buyer beware, you want to make sure you save your work as you go, because anybody can edit in here. But you can actually export these as JSONs or even just lists of codes. And this would just be, there's basically the string. So if you're writing a query, you could pull these in. So there's artifacts you can move between the environments, and they will be available to you. You can upload, obviously, JSONs into that concept set editor. That's a different training. But just an idea of all these things are here for your benefit. And what's really quite great is that one of my favorite efficiency hacks would be, let's say you're working with folks and they do create, let's say they don't export a JSON, they just export a couple of concept IDs. They take a string list. You can actually, someone could send you just that list of codes they're looking at. You could actually import it here and make your own concept set with it. And I think that's kind of neat, just because then you can share lists of codes together really quickly. And the way that functionality works is simply in the search and the import, concept identifiers needs a string list of concept IDs. concept source codes are the source concepts that you would use. The caveat here is that some of these source vocabularies use special characters. Sometimes they don't always query like great. So I often have mixed results with string lists in this one. And you could obviously put a whole JSON into if you wanted to see other people's work, but just an efficiency hack. I show you this because I've been thinking about how do you move between the worlds of code lists that you're familiar with, and you could try a list of ICD 10 codes with commas between them. Comma delimited is how these things receive information. So just something to think about. But if we go back to this idea of navigating and moving through terms, so I've been in the drug domain a lot because I know that lots of folks are thinking about how do I look for everybody who's on corticosteroids for systemic use or for oral treatment. I want to pause for a moment and say that you also don't have to start from scratch. So if you are working on something and you feel like I'm reinventing the wheel, there's got to be resources here. There totally are. And there's one resource in particular I want to show you, just because this was newly released from the Odyssey community. It's called the Phenotype Library. I can put the link in the chat. There's also a presentation that Gautam Rao gave the other week, really great presentation on how this thinking is coming together. But for those of you who would like to, let's say, borrow someone else's work and expand it, this is a knowledge base for you. So we can give you JSONs, SQL, even just those string, comma delimited lists of concepts that have been defined for a whole number of cohorts. There's tons and tons of different concept sets inside these cohorts here. I'm not even sure, I ran this package and I couldn't even tell you how many concepts or sets are built inside these cohort definitions, but there's lots and lots of work that's been done. And I bring this up just to say, sometimes it's really nice to react and modify than to have to start from bedrock. So just want to put that out there as a resource that is available to anyone who would like it. This is all open source. This is a Shiny application, but there are GitHub pages behind it. And there's lots of work going on to actually share. This tool will actually show you counts from different databases from around the world that I've submitted, how they're using these concepts. So if you wanted to just think, across the board and you're like, I don't really understand how to do this in the enclave yet, this is a great way to see just in the wild how terms are used. And its sibling is it's called Phoebe. It's our concept prevalence work as well. But I just kind of wanted to give a shout out to perhaps bedrock is not where you're starting and you start from other spots. So in the remaining time that we have, Andrew, I see the chat maybe blinking. Do folks have live questions? Does anyone want to do a worked example of something that isn't cardiology? I'm happy to, to take a request.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions going on. I think Andrew Williams has been doing a great job addressing them. If not, or if we need to get to you live, just direct message me and I can just unmute you at this point. And then if anybody has suggestions for things to cover next, please do the same.
So if we think back to, and unless someone puts another request out, if we go back to this concept we were talking about before, this idea of looking for corticosteroids, but I only want oral treatments, I can very quickly take what I see here and look it up and build concept sets in Atlas. So I could just take the concept ID, I can search for that. I could pull this classification. There's no rule that says you can't pull classifications into your concept set. So when I look at a classification, other than the purple that tells you that that's it, I also know this because ATC, that's really kind of a dead giveaway. ATC isn't going to be used as a standard. There's a lot of opportunity here to look at related concepts. So these are going to be things that subsume, but it'll also show you things that are above it. Somebody was asking about distance. This is where it also shows up. And here I can see the usage of this, these corticosteroids terms and its hierarchy in my data. But most importantly, I may decide that I'm looking through this, and this is where I might decide, I don't actually want certain things inside of this. I want certain formulations. I can pick and choose the things I want, as we were saying before. And this is where I could keep this. I could get rid of it if I only want to use standards. I can pull. This is why I might want to pull descendants. I see, wow, I get 35,000 included concepts by pulling these terms. But maybe I actually say, you know what? I want hydrocortisone and dexamethasone, but I don't want prednisolone, and I don't want this term either. And so you'll see it's going to update and allow me to do that. It's going to be a bit of your own process. Once you start to build concept sets, you might say, well, how do I know if I've done a good job of picking good concepts? Certainly helps to see the frequency of use of codes that those descendant record counts and record counts can help you. But you also might do a little bit of trial and error, and you might, as you're designing these studies for your in the domain teams, you may want to set out some time to do some sensitivity and specificity of your not just your concept sets, but of your phenotypes. And there are resources for that too, because there's no silver bullet for how comprehensive a concept set is going to be. It'll depend on kind of what you're trying to capture. And there's no rule that says that concept sets have to be a single domain. You can build them to span multiple domains. The caveat being, if you create concept sets that span multiple domains, you need to create logic that pulls from each domain. So you have to be able to write a query that then says, if you have condition concepts and you have measurements and you have procedures, you have to make sure you're telling it explicitly. And so a great example of that would be, we have this project some of you might have heard of called Charybdis. We have a bunch of different cohorts we created for Charybdis or positive. And I have quite a bit of cohorts that I've built with similar concept sets underneath it. So when you're building a concept set, it's, you know, a set of values that you're pulling in to specify a code list. And I may use the same code list for multiple pieces. So I might have a concept set that has measurements that includes concepts that span multiple domains. And so it'll all look like you have, you know, one list, but your logic, it's gonna take a second to show the included concepts. Your logic would look, well, wait, you know, you see the same thing, but this is a measurement criteria. You have to make sure you have an observation criteria that concept set pulls from multiple domains. And that's just a design thing. It may not mean anything to you right now, but it's just something to think about. So my best practice, I tend to build a single domain concept sets because I like to kind of keep them clean, but there's nothing that says you have to do that. It's just, you have to remember to make sure you put the logic in to look at multiple domains if your concept set spans multiple domains. So I see the chat is just exploding. What kinds of questions are coming in, Andrew?
Yep. I think one we haven't answered yet is how's the measurement domain table organized?
Oh yeah.
I did actually try and, oh, go ahead.
Did we? Sorry, I'm trying to.
No, it's all right. It's
everything.
got the documentation. I just recommended, Kristen, that people, it's a largish topic. So how any of the particular domains are organized with respect to which source vocabularies are included and how they're mapping to the standard categories and what classifications there are to them. I linked into the chat exactly where you're going to now,
Perfect.
where the definitions are for the things, but that's a slightly different question than how it's all organized. But if you go to the Odyssey website and look for any of the tutorials that have been done on the CDM in the past, those will include the slide decks, and those will always have a really nice, succinct description of the overall organization of the domain, exactly which source vocabularies are captured, how the hierarchy works within the standard vocabulary, and then classification vocabularies that sit on top of the standard vocabularies, like the ATC that Christian was talking about for the drug domain, or there's other sort of grouper classification vocabularies for the other domains as well. But that's probably the best place to get a succinct overview of that. It's a fairly large topic for each domain.
Absolutely. And if you're trying to kind of think through it most simply, I can direct you to the phenotype script, and it can walk you through kind of how we interact with these domains, but very, very kind of high level as it relates to the vocabulary. Every domain is going to have, essentially, this will be domain name -- concept ID, and that's where these concepts live in that table, and there are obviously different attributes. Sometimes there are in some domains 2 places where standards live. So measurement is a good example of, you have the link, or mostly link codes. Sometimes you have and you have the lab that was ordered, and then you have a qualitative result that goes with it. This actually does have concepts related to it that are also standard and non-standard. So you'll hear things like the qualitative result is mapped to this column we call value as concept ID, and the concepts still exist in the concept table, and they are from the link vocabulary. They also can come from SNOMED, and those are another way to standardize information. So there are different flavors of quote unquote standards as you move through the tables. And I agree, there's so much documentation here. It's a lot to take in. But when someone was asking before, what we do in ETL, so this is where we hark back to, each table will have this source concept ID. That's the unique representation in the data. And then its standard will be something like the domain concept ID and then the attributes for that. So for those of you who are probably waiting between getting familiar with the data model, trying to jump on the train and build concepts while you're going, you may find it really helpful to take advantage of this resource, the Eden Academy. And it actually is very much kind of self-paced. So it's an on-demand system. Anyone can create an account, and they have classes on OMOP CDM and vocabs. So like Andrew said, we have tutorials we've offered. This is kind of like the Coursera version of it. If you ever wanted to stand up your own environment, that's kind of what this Odyssey in the Box one is about. The Atlas tutorial will cover a lot of the same things I've talked to you guys about in the last 2 sessions, where it'll talk you through concept set design. It'll also talk you through cohort definitions and some of the templates that are in here. So if you notice, there are all these other tabs in Atlas that we haven't even touched. Those are covered in high and like a high level of information in this curriculum. I think this is in like 30-minute installments, if I remember. So very, very kind of digestible. And then there's other ones on ETL and even just infrastructure considerations. So definitely don't feel like you have to learn it all today. And these are all available to anyone who would like it. You also have the resource of the Book of Odyssey, which is another wiki. It's a markdown book that we've published that has different chapters around different Odyssey concepts. So not just the CDM and the vocabularies, but also around how we organize for network studies and how we conduct research. So you might find this website really helps, especially if you're traversing questions like, how do I do characterization with this data model? And there's a whole chapter on that. Or how do I assess data quality? Some of you have been using the data quality portal. Andrew hosted a great tutorial the other week that is one of our offerings you can watch videos of the different data quality tools that we have in the ecosystem. So all of that's there for you as well, kind of on demand as you need it.
Kristen, we've had some requests for maybe going over some of the cohort paper stuff. Sorry, the chat's moving. And then maybe, is there a way to import Atlas and OMOP tool data into the Enclave since it's not hooked up?
I'll start with the last question. We'll move backwards. So
Perfect.
To move things between environments, you can create concept sets, and in this tool, if you'd like, you can create them in the concept set functionality in the Enclave too. The way that they talk to each other is through the JSON format. So if you want to use this tool, this is public. You can cruise through it on any computer you have. It's really just kind of there for anyone who wants to get familiar with Odyssey tools. You can build it and actually take the JSON, copy it to your clipboard, and there's a functionality in the Enclave that you can import the JSON, and then it'll be there. So what's cool about these different environments is even though they're different secure places, because we're using standard terms and we're using the CDM structure, we can just port these little JSONs of like the specifications of what we're looking at, and we're using the same reference structures. So like by having vocab tables downloaded and installed, it knows where to go to populate this concept set. And so it'll do the heavy lifting for you. And I know Sean and other folks are working through creating resources for how to cruise through if you wanted to go from here to that import. But JSONs are a great resource that you can use for that. And then as you guys are navigating things like for the cohort paper, I don't know, is there a specific concept set or something somebody wants to start with? There are, I know, many activities inside the cohort paper, and Richard, Tell, Devira, the whole team's been really busy.
Yeah, I know Andrew had put one up. I don't know if Mr. Gervin is still with us, maybe not. I'll try to find it. Otherwise, Devira, Heidi, if you have any specific ones you want to take a peek at, we could probably do that.
No, I'm not being
That's
a very
okay.
good straight person right now. I'm sorry.
It's okay. She's been building concept sets all week for hours and hours, so she gets a pass because I know Devira's been working really hard. But maybe
well, no, it's
yeah.
working. It's working for me right now. I mean, I'm getting it. So I don't have questions that are like, oh, well, I wonder how to do this. I think I got it. So
awesome. We're
That'd
gonna
be a
start
lot of help.
teaching soon. No, I'm giving you a hard time, but
It's
this
okay.
is great. So well, why don't we could talk through, I know I'm gonna put Harold Levin on the spot. We've been talking about Alex Hauser as it's an algorithm that has lots of code lists inside of it. And I'm working through, Harold sent me a concept set that he built, and he was asking, for how to do this efficiently. And so let's say you start here. You're in a reference document that is some external resource with, essentially, these are all source vocabularies, right? And how do you move from like a PDF to something you can use? Does it have to be, I have to go every single row and go like every single term here? Do I have to search? And so you could, if you want, I know some folks have, gone and searched every single term that's here, but you may find it easier to actually take these terms, and that's where I think writing a SQL query may be faster, because you can very quickly do the concept ID lookup and build it. So how you would do that, these are all your, we call them a concept code in the concept table. So what we would do would be create a query where we take these strings, especially because they're like, the .x, kind of like the wildcards of everything in here. You could actually take this and write your query. So if I have access to these tables, I could actually create a new code workbook. Yeah, so I started doing this, and so you would create a new code workbook, save it in your spot that you're in your part of the enclave, your little secret workstation, if you will. You have to, essentially, when you build your code workbooks, obviously give it a data set to pull from. So you would have to tell it to import from that data catalog. And when you do, you'll see, it's going to store a version of those same tables. So this is the concept table. I'll zoom in a little more. I know these are really hard to see. This is the concept synonym, the vocab, concept ancestor, concept relationship, concept class. And you might say, do I really need all of them? And you may not. You may only really need the concept ancestor, and maybe concept relationship. What each of these do, so they just have different pieces of information you might have to join to. But when you're interacting with the concept table, if we, this isn't PII or anything, this is a reference table. So I think I'm allowed to show you. Your thing that you're looking at in that list is actually this column, the concept code. So we could write a query that creates a look for in this column, these strings, and then have it turn back the concept IDs, and then we can start to create lists of the standard or the concept IDs, and then find, is it a standard here? If not, we'd use that relationship table for maps too. You could go through that. completely appreciate that if you are not a SQL user or like this is kind of foreign to you, don't worry. In a few in a few weeks, we're going to have, I think, more reference examples of how to do this quickly. So that this should be kind of easy to traverse if you find, you know, I've got a huge batch of things I want to look up. But I am happy to help walk folks through and create, you know, code workbook examples. I admit I'm still learning how to figure out where to share it somewhere that people can see it, but I know we're working to do that. So don't be afraid to ask questions if you're moving through things where you have huge lists of terms you're trying to bring in, because it sometimes is faster to just write it as a quick database query than manually go through every term. You know, I don't really want to search every single one, but you could. I mean, you would start, you know, from the beginning, you'd be looking, well, this is a non-standard. I'd have to then find its related concepts. So this maps to, this is its standard. How do I know that? Well, it's a bit of a sleight of hand because I know in this tab, it's going to show me its relatives of other source concepts. So this is like 398. This is a, you know, has two decimal places in the ICD-9 ontology. It's going to tell me things kind of in that same spot, but it's also going to tell me that this is the standard. And I know it's standard because from the color, but I also know because it's SNOMED, and SNOMED is the standard for that domain. But I could go through and start to click and select each concept that maps to the terms I see in this sheet. But as you might imagine, and I'm sure as Harold can tell you, it takes a while. So that may not work for every use case if you have tons of things you're trying to batch import. But if you have the time to cruise, it's actually kind of it's not terrible. But I'll pause there for just a moment.
Read my mind. So we have some questions. What version of OMOP? Looks like Devira got to that 5.3.1 and N3C. I guess maybe are there any plans on 6.0 that we know about right now?
Great question. So we're as a community working towards moving towards V6, but a lot of the tooling, Atlas included, have not been we have not kind of optimized it to take advantage of the developments that are in V6. So you might hear a lot of people say, just stick to V5.3.1 for a while because we're still getting there. It's been about a year, but it hasn't been a very normal year. As you guys might imagine, it's been a little bit wild. So it's on our development plan to better support V6. We'd love to talk to folks if you want to do that, but right now, all of the packages by 5.3.1, so the methods library, the DQ dashboards, the other stuff, they're really made to run for 5.3.1. And what's going to happen is folks are, like Erica Voss and Claire Blacketer and other folks who do a lot of ETL work in the community are going to publish DDLs to help people with their migrations when tools are finally ready to support it. So keep an eye, but don't feel like you're being left behind. It's kind of a joke that we say it's coming, and it'll happen someday, but it's like the Taj Mahal. It might take a while to build it. So
I think that's all of it. Again, I apologize if I am skipping over your question. We have a lot of folks helping answer, which is awesome. So just let me know if we did miss you. We have about 13 minutes left, so we're kind of in the final stretch for folks. I'm going to put out a poll to gauge interest in an OMOP 301. So for folks who have joined, we're obviously here in 201, and then we had a 101 a couple weeks ago. So we can continue the series if folks are finding this helpful, or if you have other feedback, things you'd like to maybe focus on more, just let us know too, and we can address those in future presentations. I'll kick it back.
Awesome. And a couple of resources. So if you are like out in the wild and I don't know, it's whatever o'clock and you don't feel like slacking me or Andrew Williams or somebody else, you're always welcome to post questions here. This is essentially the Odyssey message board that people talk all the time. What do I do with null death dates? How do I deal with procedure modifiers? There's different things about different package development, sometimes in English, sometimes in other languages. This is just a great place for resources of just how other folks are using. I think in the future, we may have internal facing kind of equivalent for N3C But by all means, you're a member of this community now by being in 3C, you're using the methods. So we're happy to send resources for the domain teams, especially those who are, working through, I have a code list, I'm trying to bring it in, I'm trying to create a cohort definition. I know Devera and I are working to try to create a SWAT team who can help support it. By all means, feel free to Slack me if there's anything I can do. I can show you some efficiency hacks. I haven't even shown you some of my favorite ones because you really have to be in the middle of doing work for them to be useful. But there are a lot of ways to, optimize how you move through these screens, or how you use these resources between the table structures and things like that. So hopefully we can share that with you. And yeah, if you're curious too, I don't know how many of you have built concept sets that are you see this little button over here that says optimize. If you've never used this, and it actually is a way for the tool will tell you basically how good a job you're doing using your the vocab like hierarchies. So this one would probably be pretty clean. I'm going to copy it just so I don't muck with somebody else's work, but I could, it'll tell me, oh, this one's fully optimized, because it means you're taking like the cleanest usage of these things. You're not using overlapping terms, and this is kind of an easy one because there's 3, but it may be. Let's see if I steal this. Oh, these are all mapped. I'm going to see. It may suggest other things for you, like, oh, what's an optimal definition for this concept set? And it might give you a suggested way to pull it. In this case, this is a kind of off-label one. You might actually want to go from the descendant or the non-standard here into a related and pull that. And then if you could pull, and as you add more things, it'll actually, you have to rerun it to ask it, how am I doing? But if you have a huge drug list, right? Like let's say you've curated like a giant list of drugs that you're looking for, and you're trying to figure out, have I boiled the ocean here? Or am I missing something? It may not tell you what you're missing, but it may help you clean it up to take advantage of, the class overlaps and things like that. And all of that is kind of things that are hidden in plain sight that you might not know are at your disposal.
All right, so we have about 9 minutes to go. The results of the poll are still trickling in, but we have a 70% return on the folks, and we have a 92%.
Can't get enough of us, huh?
Yeah, we have a 92% in favor. So hopefully we can turn that out nationally in a few days, but we will definitely be scheduling an OMOP 301 for the near future for folks. So if you do have topics you're interested in, you can feel free to email me or let Kristen know as well, and we can define some stuff to go in deeper on. Otherwise, we can do another kind of Q&A led session like this. Any other final questions or topics to cover here?
Maybe just a point for folks as you're using the enclave data and you see things, if you see non-standards in the concept ID, like where you were expecting to see a standard, feel free to file an issue and report it, because it could be, it may be a data quality problem where somebody is not adhering to convention. And we do a lot of screening of these databases. I know Emily and Andrew Gervin and team spent a lot of time, but we're human and sometimes we don't see every single imperfection. So if something looks kind of funky and you're like, hey, I was in this class or in this hour and I heard that this shouldn't be like that, by all means, feel free to raise and report as you're using information so we can make sure we're doing our part to keep a continuous improvement cycle. And actually, I left my screen too early. I'm going to ask one more time. How are we feeling? Hopefully no one's number 5, although if you are, I really feel for you because it's Friday. But hopefully we're feeling better. Dr. Fauci would want you to feel like a number 1 in every day. But this is hard work. I know this is a lot to learn. I know that many of you probably feel I am speaking in tongues to you. By all means, this is the kind of stuff that you'll learn as you do it. So don't feel like if you're not getting it, it's okay. And you'll probably find different opportunities. We'd love to collaborate and help make this easier for you as you go through.
I'm working on trending to negative Fauci today, so we'll see what the scale includes next time. So again, we'll have a 301. Bill recommended here in the chat to maybe look at kind of more of the N3C specifics, it seems like, and I think that'd be a good idea. I know there's been a lot of questions around code sets and all that fun stuff, so we'll keep that in mind. And then I think tentatively we'll be looking at the next couple of weeks to do one again. And then I've had some questions on how to find out about this stuff. So if you go, I'll put it in the chat for everyone. They're targeted kind of towards our domain teams, but everyone is of course welcome. So it'll go out to all of those mailing lists. So if you're already a member there, you should hopefully be seeing them. If you're a member of a domain team and aren't getting emails from me, please go to the domain teams link there and get on board. And then we also put them in the bulletin, and they're on the N3C calendar as well, which I'll put a link to in the chat in just a second. So otherwise, if you're not finding stuff out, just let me know and I can help you get acquainted with stuff, or if you have suggestions on places we could post, just let me know too. Thank you again, Kristen. I appreciate it because I don't have to learn it and give the talk. It was expertly given. And thanks again to everybody also for helping in the chat. I really appreciate that as well. Makes it a little easier for me. Any
thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. If we do want to do more hands-on, we may need to self-organize around who can see what. I think that might be a screening because I don't know what I'm allowed to pull up. So, but I know I see Trisha Francis hiding on here. We'll definitely work to find the right user groups to roll out some of these hands-on in 301. And by all means, make a wish list. Christmas is coming. We'll try our best to, you've all been good this year.